Of all the chancy, risky things in life, racing is right up there with trapeze artists and stand-up comedy. It's great while it works. He buried him standing up, mane and tail spread out as if he was galloping, and buried him facing east, which is what they do with champions ever since the great days of the Arab horsemen in the desert. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. This week we've got something a little different because I've written a book which is coming out any minute now, and it's called Chance, or if you like, Chance. The subtitle is Of Grit and Gamblers and the Romance of the Racing Life. It's a collection of racing stories, but it's not all about horses. It's more often about people. It could have a much longer subtitle. It could also be about guts and greed and glitz, because all those elements are found in racing, as well as its fair share of heroes and villains, skullduggery and downright criminality. There are 23 stories in the book. I chose them from probably hundreds that I know of, and I had to think for a fair while to work out how to start this book. How do you start a book dedicated to the proposition that of all the chancy, risky things in life, racing is right up there with trapeze artists and stand-up comedy? It's great while it works. The way I began the book was to describe the end of the late Floyd Podgornick. And this is how it starts. They say no one with an unraced 2-year-old ever kills himself. Floyd Podgornick shot that theory full of holes with a fancy Italian pistol in the bathroom of his penthouse in St Kilda Road. And that's how I started the book, because I think the suicide of Floyd Podgornick in 1990 told us a lot about the sort of characters that were big in the 1980s in Australia, and the sort of characters that were attracted to racing, to the highs and lows, the winning and the losing and the risk factor. Floyd Podgornick, known as Floyd, had walked down the gangplank of a migrant ship back in 1963 with nothing but a cheap cardboard suitcase. All he had was a gambler's instincts and a willingness to work hard. And what he did was work hard all day on building sites and play cards all night. And between his nerve, his judgment, and probably luck, Floyd Podgornick turned himself into a very good operator in the building industry. And as the building industry grew in the 60s and 70s, Podgornick grew with it. And he went from having a small crew of concreters and scaffolders and that sort of stuff to having a bigger crew. And ultimately, he became a very big developer who built very big buildings. He was one of those guys who ran around building skyscrapers back in an era when people like the Grollos and others were doing the same. And in many ways, Floyd Podgornick was similar to those people, and yet probably inherently more stylish. He used to drive a black Bentley with white leather seats. He looked like somebody from a Godfather movie. He was, handsome, debonair. He dressed really well. He married a very astute, tough woman, I think called Lorraine Podgornick, who ended up running Florentino restaurant years later. But he was well known towards the end of the 1980s for squiring around town a young woman called Carolyn Pagliardi, who was known in those days as his mistress, which was a word used in those days, his girlfriend, in other words. She was a statuesque and beautiful woman who was known wherever they went, and they were a very handsome couple. They were known on every major racetrack around Australia and probably in several other countries as well. And by the time everything started to go wrong in 1987, when Wall Street crashed in 1987, Floyd Podgornick was flying very high. He'd raced dozens and dozens of horses. He'd set up a very plush place down in the southeastern suburbs near Carrum. He had a property that he called Symbol Lodge, and he'd built it pretty well from the ground up. It had beautiful, beautiful stabling. It had horse swimming pools with Mediterranean blue tiles. It had padded walkways. It had everything set up in such a way that people could have lived in the stables. And he spent a lot of money, not only on the property and on the buildings, but on the horses to go in it. And so by 1990, Floyd Podgornick had bought dozens of yearlings for lots of money. He'd sent a guy to the yearling sales to buy up big, and by the time Floyd's business started to wilt under the weight of the aftershocks of the stock market collapse, he had a lot of expensive horse flesh costing a lot of money at this property, Symbol Lodge. And so by 1990, when Floyd's starting to go broke because the building industry is going broke, he had a heap of expensive horseflesh. He shoots himself. It's a tragedy. It happened within, I think, 10 days or something after one of his best friends in the business, Charlie Mantello, had jumped out of a window from another building in St Kilda Road. And so these two millionaire property developers killed themselves in the space of, I think, a fortnight, which sent shockwaves not only around business circles and around building circles, but around the horse racing fraternity, because Charlie Mantello had also been mixed up in racing in a big way. The thing was that all those young 2-year-olds that Floyd had in his stables hadn't fired a shot before Floyd killed himself. But the week after his death, one of them won a race. And then the trickle turned into a torrent. They started to win, and more of them started to win. And indeed, his best horse, a horse called Centro, won one of the big group black type races and ran second in a derby. And so had Floyd Podgornick not killed himself that day and had hung around for a matter of months, he would have seen his stable come good, and it might have cheered him up immensely. But that's not the way that racing and gambling works. It's all or nothing. And in the end, for Floyd, it was nothing. I used that story as a way into the book because I thought it summed up something about the nature of chance, of the extreme highs and lows of racing and of gambling, and that it underlined for me the wisdom of those people who have observed racing for many years and have come up with some very pithy lines about it. For instance, Damon Runyon, the great American sports writer and crime writer, he said all horse players die broke. By that he meant all punters die broke. What Runyon says echoes a saying that Australian punters have always had, and that is that the punt giveth and the punt taketh away, and that ultimately, no matter how many highs you have in racing, there's a low just around the corner. And this is probably the central message of the stories that I've gathered, because it shows how a little bit of luck can go a long way. Just 3 years before Floyd Podgornick ended it all, he had gutted the Sydney betting ring with a plunge on an imported horse called Knife. He won so much money that day that he had to get a suitcase, which wasn't made of cardboard, to carry the cash out of the racecourse. It went down in racing legend as the day that Floyd won half the money in Sydney. And yet, just 3 years later, he was so depressed about everything that he ended it. It's a metaphor for what happens in racing. I've collected many stories here. Those who think of this book as being Underbelly Goes to the Races won't be very disappointed, because although it is more than that, and there are other sorts of stories in the collection, there are indeed stories of crimes and criminality, of skullduggery, of rogues, lovable rogues and the other sort. And I'd like to run through a couple of those. One of them is the inside story of the great bookie robbery of 1976. It's a famous crime. Most people know about the bookie robbery these days, but I've been able to add a little more to the story and to give it a bit more context and depth because I've been in touch with a lot of people who were bookmakers in that era, some of whom were in the room when the robbers came in, and some of whom know a lot about it because they were connected with those in the room. And indeed, one old guy I was able to find was connected, he says, with some of the robbers who he knew very well. And so the inside story of the bookie robbery is one element that's interesting. But there are other stories, such as the real stories behind the fine cotton scandal. Now, I know there's been books written and documentaries made and endless stories done about the saga, which have tended to make it look like the Three Stooges, a sort of a comic caper. There's not much that's comic about the fine cotton affair because it ultimately was staged by crooks pulling the strings from far away. These were very brutal, bad, dangerous people, and they were intimately associated with the death of George Brown, a horse trainer from Sydney who raced horses in Brisbane sometimes. George Brown was murdered on the orders of people who were mixed up in the fine cotton saga. And so it's deep down a very sinister story, and I think I've been able to nail down many loose ends, some of which will be aired in News Corp papers very soon, if it isn't already. And we'll be back after this. Racing is full of legends about plungers and ring-ins. One of the great plunge stories is about a horse that raced in Australia under the name Torbeck. I was around as a young reporter when the Torbeck sting was pulled at Seymour in the early 80s. And the full story of how that came about has never actually been told before. But I was able to trace that story back to its origins in New Zealand, where a very astute trainer called Alan Jones bought a pair of yearlings at a very cheap horse sale. And when he took them home, his wife Linda, who later became one of the pioneer female jockeys and a very good jockey, she laughed at this pair of yearlings as he led them off the float because one didn't look terribly good at all and the other one looked like a drowned rabbit. And the one that looked like a drowned rabbit, it was very small, very thin, very fine, very shivery. She thought it looked more or less like a big foal, not like a yearling. And she laughed at her husband, Alan, who had to agree with her that even though he'd only paid, I think, $700, it did look like a fair bit of money for this little horse. But the horse was beautifully named. They called him Shady Deal, which reflected his pedigree, but also what would happen to him. Because it turns out that when they break in these two unwanted ugly ducklings, they're both very good. But the better one of the pair is the little one they call Shady Deal. And what Alan Jones and his wife Linda used to do was to prepare a lot of young horses in New Zealand that they'd bought at the right price, and they'd find a couple that were good enough to sell to the Aussies, because Australian trainers and owners would love to fly across the Tasman in those days and prospect the Kiwis looking for something they could take home and win races with, preferably betting plunge races. And two or three smarties from Australia came across to look at Jones's string of horses. And one of them was Rick Hore-Lacey, who then a prominent trainer, former lawyer by training, brother of the prominent barrister Dyson Hore-Lacey. And Rick Hore-Lacey was a very astute trainer and a massive gambler. And he epitomises everything about gamblers because he once won the price of an entire luxury estate, a massive estate. He won it on the punt. And in the end, I think he lost the lot and is living in relative poverty these days. But he came across to see these horses, and Alan Jones' mate, a bloke called Wayne Walters, a cunning Kiwi training in Australia, he also had come across to look at Jones's horses, and he wanted the one they called Shady Deal. And to throw Rick Hore-Lacey off the scent, they bound up the horse's front legs in bandages as if he'd had something wrong with it. And they put so many bandages on it, it looked like a cripple. And Horlacy was told, look, we think he's bowed a tendon or he's got a problem, whatever. And so Horlacy didn't buy the horse, but Wayne Walters did. And he did because he jumped on this unraced 3-year-old, I think it was there, and they'd ridden out around their training track, a private training track. And Alan Jones was riding, I think, a 5-year-old mare that was a last start winner and a good class of racehorse. And this unraced 3-year-old, or maybe even 2-year-old, was up against this open class mare, and he beat her easily. And Alan Jones said, this is probably the best maiden in New Zealand. That means the best horse that has not won a race in New Zealand. And I think he's ideal for your purposes. So Jones buys the horse. He gets him back to Australia. He changes his name from Shady Deal. Now, it may be that he had to do that because there was already a Shady Deal racing in Australia. But in any case, it was a good move. And what he did was he looked around and he found a horse of the same colour and same general description, that is, a brown gelding foaled in, 1976 or whatever it was. And the horse that he found to match that description was a horse called Torbrek, 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 a very slow conveyance trained by a jumping trainer. And what Walters did, because he was a very cunning Kiwi trainer, he named his horse Shady Deal. He renamed it with the Victorian authorities Torbek, Torbek. And so he thought that at a rough glance in a form guide, a lot of punters would mistake his horse, the former Shady Deal, for the very slow jumper trained by an old fella called Theo Howe. And I think this ruse worked pretty well. And what Walters did wasn't strictly illegal. Setting up bookies for a fall isn't illegal. It's just a way to try and make a big, quick killing in racing. But they went to elaborate lengths, and Walters had pelled up with a group of very astute professional punters. These people were very good at what they did, and they took no chances, and they shaved the odds to their own advantage the best way they could. And what they did, they registered the horse Torbeck with a very small-time trainer at Bendigo called Barry Fordry. And Barry Fordry, I think, might have been another Kiwi, but he was certainly a very small-time trainer. He trained at Bendigo. He trained, one winner every 6 months, and was quite a small name around the circuit. When Torbeck was entered in his name, no one took much notice. But the reality was that when Torbeck was picked up by the truck from the airport, from the air freighter, the truck did not take Torbeck to Barry Fordry's at Bendigo. It took him to Wayne Walters' stables at Seymour. And Wayne Walters had kept this so secret that even his own brother, Graham Walters, then a prominent jumping jockey, didn't realise that something was afoot. He didn't tell any of his own staff what the horse was. He didn't make any reference to the horse apart from saying it's just some slow thing that he'd got from New Zealand. He basically ignored it, and he entered him for a race at Seymour on a particular date, and he entered another horse that he knew had some ability, a horse that was probably good enough to win the race at a pinch. He also entered it, and his idea was to back this second horse. I think its name was Brett Regent, and the idea was to put enough money on Brett Regent to make it a false favourite, to make it a favourite for the race, so that the odds on Torbeck would blow out and out and out and get longer and longer. And then at the last minute, the idea was that they would plunge on Torbeck and put far more money on Torbeck than they had on Brett Regent, which was really a case of being a loss leader, putting a certain amount on the horse that they knew would probably run second in order to get longer odds on the horse they thought would win. And what they did, they get Barry Fordry to come over from Bendigo and to drive into Walters' property, load up Torbeck on his float, drive out of Walters' property about 300 metres or 500 metres around to the racecourse proper, unload the horse, put it in a stall and stand around and wait for the race as if Fordry was indeed training the horse. That was in fact the first time that Barry Fordry had seen the horse as far as we know. Well, the plan goes off like clockwork. The punters fly to Sydney because the beauty of this is that the Seymour race meeting coincides, and this is a deliberate thing, coincides with a big Sydney race meeting, city race meeting, I think at Canterbury. And the punters go to Canterbury and they plunge on Torbeck at lucrative odds. And they won this is 1981, they won the price of, several houses. I think they won several $100,000 at a time when I know I bought a house for $26,000. So they probably won enough to buy 15 small houses like mine or, 5 houses in Toorak. It was a very big sting and it went off perfectly. And it was the start of a phenomenal career for this little horse, Torbeck. He was a tiny, thin thing. He was so narrow. He later got cancer in an eye, so he ended up being a one-eyed horse. He had quite a lot wrong with him. He used to shiver and shake and sweat a lot. He looked terrible being led around in the ring. When he was saddled, he'd be led around, and bookmakers would almost always take a set against him and say that thing couldn't win. It couldn't win on looks. And they'd tend to turn his odds out against basically what the form guide said, because repeatedly Torbeck, when the owners backed him, Torbeck would win. And he went on to win race after race after race. And, of course, to lose the odd one for several years. And Wayne Walters, scallywag Kiwi, and his scallywag friends, the professional punters, won a heap of money on Torbeck. And Wayne Walters told me he's a very funny man, quite an eccentric guy, and I think a very good horse trainer in his own way. And he said he loved that little horse a lot. He said, I wondered whether I could get some more condition on him, make him a bit fatter and a bit shinier and a bit musclier, so he looked a bit better. And I spent, 8 months or 10 months feeding him and working him up and trying to make him look bigger and stronger. And he looked great at the end of it, or he looked a lot better, but he said he couldn't gallop. The only way he could gallop well was when he was very, very slender and fine and not carrying any weight, and that was the way he raced best. The story goes that Wayne Walters ended up buying 2 farms, I think, up out of Shepparton, out of Tatura, and he had Torbeck there, and he was still training him as an 11-year-old horse, despite the fact he'd had cancer in one eye and this and that. And he said he was setting him to make another comeback, and I think he wanted to win the Swan Hill Cup or something like that. And the horse went down with colic. And colic is when a horse gets basically a very severe stomach ache, and they roll around on the ground and they twist their bowel, twist their guts, and it kills them. It's quite dangerous for horses. And it requires immediate veterinary attention and surgery and things often. And when Walter's staff rang him, he was living on another farm, a few kilometres from where Torbeck was. They called him Stoney the pony. They said, Stoney's got a problem, he's got colic. He said, don't let the vet give him whatever it was, some sedative. He's allergic to it. But anyway, by the time he drove over there, the vet had got there ahead of him and had given him the sedative, and he died of the sedative. And Wayne Walters was heartbroken about his little horse, and he dug a big deep hole, a grave on the property there, and he buried him standing up, mane and tail spread out as if he was galloping, and buried him facing east, which is what they do with champions ever since the great days of the Arab horsemen in the desert. That's how they buried their great horses. And that is how Wayne Walters buried Torbeck, alias Stoney, alias Shady Deal. I've called that story Shady Deal for obvious reasons. It wasn't anything criminal. If taking money from bookmakers is not criminal, it was not against the law. They might have bent a few rules of racing here and there, but didn't break many. And it goes down as one of the great, well-planned, long-term plunges in Australian turf history. There are many others. One of them is the series of plunges run by a wonderful young bookmaker called Mark Reed. Funny thing, he's got the same name as a prominent gangster, but it, of course, had nothing to do with the prominent gangster. It's just a common sort of name. And Mark Reed, the bookmaker, was a clean-cut, highly intelligent, smart guy who was brought up from the age of about 5 to be very knowledgeable about the racetrack and about punting and about betting, because his mother, Mabel, was essentially a professional punter and a commission agent. She would put on bets for horse trainers and others. And his father, his biological father, was also a gambling man and a punter and so on. And his stepfather was also a very prominent track watcher and commission agent and punter. And between all these people and his various uncles and cousins and others, Mark Reed was educated in the ways of bookmaking and punting from a very young age. And interestingly, he tackled racing from every angle. He was not only a wonderfully successful young bookmaker who took the Melbourne ring by storm in his 20s, much to the angst and displeasure of his older bookmaking cohort, but he raced horses with a great success. He didn't train them, but he learned a lot about how to select them and how to select trainers to train them. He set up a massive stable operation at Flemington or near Flemington, and he had his own property up the road at Toolern Vale, and he bred horses, he bought horses, and he introduced really to Australia the concept of syndicates, an idea that had been pioneered in America. And he was able to put together a heap of wealthy people who followed his lead. They would buy a lot of yearlings and they would find among them one or two that were talented enough that they could train them up on the quiet in relative secrecy and produce them and plunge on them in a massive interstate plunge. They would organise really sophisticated stings. There were many of them. They did this several times, sometimes with the same horse, sometimes with other horses. But the most famous one is the plunge on a horse called Getting Closer. Getting Closer was a horse that was trained at Flemington by Mark Reed's private trainer, a very eccentric Queenslander called Henry Davis. And Henry Davis had some very astute track riders working for him. One of them was Michael Fraser. And these guys, they went to elaborate lengths to disguise Getting Closer's true ability. And what they did was tell everybody that this young horse had soundness issues, and they produced it in bandages at the stables and said, we have to send him up to the farm on the truck to have a spell so he gets over his shin soreness or whatever it might be, and we'll bring him back in, 5 months or whatever and have another go. But what they actually did was, and only 3 people knew the real story, the truck float turned up and they loaded up the horse, and instead of going up to the farm, which was an hour away, it drove all night to Sydney. Track rider Michael Fraser in the front with the driver, and they unloaded the horse at dawn in Sydney at a small, rented loose box there with 2 or 3 other much more humble horses that Reed had already sent up. These were just ordinary horses that he'd sent up there. They had the virtue of being much the same colour as the good horse Getting Closer. And when Mike Fraser worked them, he was able to confuse those people watching without actually telling any lies by working them early in the morning when it was fairly dark and using the same saddle cloths and saddles and things so that people wouldn't be sure which Melbourne horse was which. Meanwhile, Mark Reed very wisely stayed well away from Sydney, well away from the whole operation, and never said a word to anyone. When the horse was entered for a race in Sydney, ready to plunge on, something went wrong the first time that they entered it, and it had to be scratched. And at the time, they thought this was a great pity. But it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because the race they had picked out was won by a horse called Dalmatia. And Dalmatia went on to become a multiple group winner, and sadly probably had Getting Closer raced against Dalmatia that day. Dalmatia would have beaten Getting Closer and they would have lost their money. But by absolute luck, I think they were balloted out of the race because their horse, Getting Closer, had no exposed form. It was balloted out, and so they had to enter it a fortnight later at another meeting. And that is where the sting unfolded. They booked local champion jockey Malcolm Johnson. Malcolm Johnson was a star, but he was a local, he was a Sydney rider, and so there was nothing unusual about him riding there. It wasn't as if Reid had sent up his top Melbourne rider, Greg Hall, to ride the horse, and so there was nothing odd about Malcolm Johnson riding it. But as Fraser, the track rider, legged Malcolm Johnson onto it, he said, as you ride out, watch the tote odds. You'll see it come in from, I think it was 50 to 1 or something. And it was even longer with some bookies. They got massive odds. The Reid team had sent up a heap of people to back it. Reid and his wife turned up to the races, as did some of their friends, but they'd also imported an entire football team from Melbourne, I think a Broadmeadows footy team, and they'd handed each of these people an envelope, and inside each envelope was a sum of money, I think $1,500, quite a lot of money in those days, and there was, 20 of them or whatever. On the front of each envelope was the name of a bookmaker, so if you had an envelope, you would read the name of the bookie, you'd go over and stand in the queue next to that bookie, and when Mark Reid's wife, Shari, gave the signal, I think she waved a scarf or a hat or something. When she gave the signal, everybody in the team tore open their envelope and bet on the horse whose name was in the envelope. They hadn't been told the horse's name, but in the envelope was the money with the horse's name, and they bet and they bet and they bet until all the money was gone. Mark Reid walked around the ring and he had thousands and thousands of dollars on the horse. In the end, Mark Reid and his crew get on about $60,000 and some more money off course. They average 13 to 1. Various estimates of this massive coup made it into print and into legend, but Reid later nominated that he won $800,000 on course and $470,000 off course, which in the early 80s was a fantastic sum. In fact, it was enough that he was able to pay off the mortgage on a harbourside mansion called Boomerang, which is one of Australia's finest private houses. Still much coveted. I think the last time it changed hands was for something like $50 million, and it's currently owned by Lindsay Fox or one of his family. That is how much money Getting Closer landed for Mark Reid that day. He was able to pay off the mansion Boomerang, which he'd bought for $3 million, and he owed about half of that. Paid it off, and he doubled his money on the mansion within a year or two. And it's been sold for far more ever since. It gives an idea of the scale of the plunges that Mark Reid and his friends were able to pull off. And he didn't just do it once, he did it several times. He had plunges with a horse called Cold Chisel. He had plunges with a range of horses, I think one in Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, and I think Brisbane. He would go anywhere to pull off a plunge. But in those days, of course, the bookmakers' rings in all the state capitals were enormous. You could send betting agents, commission agents to every race meeting in Australia on a given day and get a fortune on and win a bag full of cash. In a way, that doesn't happen anymore. And we'll be back after this to finish our story. The days of massive betting are probably past us. This was the golden age of betting in Australia. It was from World War II until about the 1990s, and then it started rapidly to fade away. Some say that the bubble of money came from all the troops returning from World War II and later from the Korean War, where they had pockets full of deferred pay. They were often young men, footloose. They were damaged by war. They were determined to have a good time. They liked to have a drink and have a bet. And some say that the sheer amount of money that they bet in those couple of decades after the war inflated the betting economy in a way that it has never been seen since. Of course, the other factor is this, that really gambling at the races on racehorses was almost the only way that you could gamble in those days. The only alternative was illegal casinos or two-up games, that sort of stuff. The only legal gambling in big numbers was at the races, and that's the way it went. And that's why a lot of the stories from this book have their roots in that era, what I would call the golden era of the punt. Of course, this is a barefaced attempt to get people interested in the book. The book is called Chance. It is subtitled Of Grit and Gamblers and the Romance of the Racing Life. It's by Andrew Rule, that's me. It's published by Pam Macmillan, and I think you'll find that it is the ideal thing to be giving other people for Father's Day, for Christmas, and for birthdays. And if people don't buy it for you, I think they don't love you.